As we know, it was 100 years ago, during the first week of 1909, that three people met in New York to form what would become the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. One was the descendant of abolitionists, the second was Jewish, the third a Southerner whose mother's people were Kentucky slaveholders, as my father's people were Kentucky slaves. The NAACP was founded at the nadir in the lives of 20th century American blacks. Following the demise of Reconstruction, a wave of terror had descended across the South, where 9 of every 10 blacks lived, 3/4 in rural areas. The national government had abandoned blacks to state control, reducing them to near slavery. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, described black life then and the world a black man or woman might see. He wrote, he felt his poverty, without a cent, without a home, without land, tools, or savings. He had entered into competition with rich, landed, and skilled neighbors. To be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardships. He felt the weight of his ignorance, not simply of letters, but of life, of business, of the humanities. The accumulated sloth and shirking and awkwardness of decades and centuries shackled his hands and his feet. Nor was his burden all poverty and ignorance. The red stain of bastardy, which 2 centuries of systematic legal defilement of Negro women had stamped upon his race, meant not only the loss of ancient African chastity, but also the hereditary weight of a mass of corruption from white adulterers, threatening almost the obliteration of the Negro home. The immediate spark of the founding of the NAACP was the Springfield Ride of 1908, when African Americans were lynched within a half mile of the only home that Abraham Lincoln ever owned, and within 2 miles of his grave. When we were founded in 1909, Theodore Roosevelt was ending his 2nd term. He shared traits with many of today's Negrophobes. He liked individual African Americans, but believed the mass were less than human. Few presidents after him had a good opinion of black Americans or of the NAACP. Tapes released just this past summer tell us yet more about another president, Richard Nixon. In 1973, when the Supreme Court handed down Roe v. Wade, Nixon said nothing publicly, but he's heard on tape saying, "There are times when abortion is necessary. I know that, when you have a black and a white." And then he added, "or rape." Well, 35 years later, the nation elected the offspring of a black man and a white woman as its president. We've now arrived at the intersection of hope and change, and a black man is directing the traffic. It's fitting he was sworn in almost exactly 100 years after the founding of the NAACP. Just as he launched his candidacy for the presidency in the shadow of Abraham Lincoln on the steps of the Illinois State Capitol, so the NAACP issued a call to the nation on the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth in 1909. That call asked then, as we do now, for all believers in democracy to join in the renewal of the struggle for civil and political liberty. The original incorporation papers of the NAACP listed as its goals to promote equality of rights and eradicate caste or racial prejudice among the citizens of the United States, to advance the interest of colored citizens, to secure for them impartial suffrage, and to increase their opportunities for securing justice in the courts, education for their children, and complete equality before the law. That remains the NAACP's mission today. The NAACP's earliest efforts were aimed at ending racial profiling in the media. Negro steals clock or Negro robs bank. We convinced some newspapers to drop racial designations in their stories. We began a decades-long campaign against lynching, but were never able to secure a federal anti-lynching law. From our earliest days, we embarked on a strategy of litigation aimed at striking down racial restrictions enshrined in law. NAACP pressure integrated the officer corps in the First World War. We hired Clarence Darrow to defend Henry and Ossian Sweet in 1926. They had exercised the American right of self-defense when a white mob attacked their Detroit home. In 1930, we joined with organized labor to defeat the nomination of segregationist Judge John J. Parker to the Supreme Court. And then we targeted and defeated many of the senators who had supported Parker's nomination. We joined A. Philip Randolph in threatening a mass march on Washington in 1941, resulting in President Roosevelt's executive order, creating a Fair Employment Practices Committee. A series of our school cases culminated in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, 45 years after the NAACP's birth and 55 years ago this year. Brown effectively ended segregation's legality. It also gave a nonviolent army the license to challenge segregation's morality as well. As Richard Kluger has written, not until the Supreme Court acted in 1954 did the nation acknowledge it had been blaming the black man for what it had done to him. His sentence to second-class citizenship had been commuted. The quest for meaningful equality, equality in fact as well as in law, had begun. So if the Depression in 1929 had convinced America it was obliged to protect its citizens' well-being, the Brown decisions of 54 and 55 began to convince reluctant Americans they would have to share their bounty, their knowledge, and their world. Unfortunately, the white citizens of Virginia were among the last to be convinced. 5 lower court cases had been consolidated into the Brown decision. One, Davis versus County School Board, originated in Prince Edward County. The district court relied on testimony from none other than the president of the University of Virginia, Colgate Garden. The court said, "So ingrained and wrought in the texture of life is the principle of separate schools that the president of the University of Virginia expressed to the court his judgment that its involuntary elimination would severely lessen the interest of the people of the state in public schools, lessen the financial support, and so injure both races." Darden could fairly be considered an expert on the subject of school segregation. 2 years earlier, he and the Board of Visitors fought to prevent Gregory Swanson's admission to the U.Va. Law School. After the NAACP successfully secured Swanson's admission, Darden made his life so difficult that Swanson withdrew. University of Virginia PhD J. Douglas Smith writes, "It was Alice Jackson's application to the University of Virginia in 1935 that shook the foundations of managed race relations and permanently altered the contours of interracial cooperation in the Old Dominion." Jackson's petition followed the NAACP's victory, winning Donald Gaines admission to the University of Maryland. The Board of Visitors rejected Jackson, and the NAACP took up her case and her cause. The Richmond Times-Dispatch's Virginia's Dabney, often complimented by black Virginians for his relative racial moderation, spoke out strongly against what he called the NAACP's belligerent efforts, preferring, as Smith's book describes, that white Virginians continue managing racial change. While Jackson's appeal was pending, Virginia passed the 1936 Educational Equality Act to provide scholarships for blacks to go to out-of-state schools. She became one of them, and the NAACP dropped her appeal. Eventually, Virginia would respond to Brown with massive resistance, a term coined by segregationist U.S. Senator Harry F. Byrd, shutting down schools across the state, including here in Charlottesville. Smith writes, "Eminent Virginians have attempted to dismiss massive resistance as an aberration, but it was not an aberration at all. Massive resistance gave the lie to Virginia's system of managed race relations. Although less violent than in other southern states, whites in Virginia proved to be just as committed to segregation and often less honest with themselves and the black citizens of the Commonwealth." As a result of further NAACP suits, massive resistance efforts were struck down and schools ordered to reopen in early 1959. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the end of massive resistance, but we know that schools did not reopen immediately in Prince Edward County, where the entire system was shut down for 5 years, and we know that the efforts of massive resistance and the denial of equal education opportunity across the country continues on today. A year after Brown, an NAACP activist in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat on a city bus so a white man could sit down. 5 years after Montgomery, 4 young black men, college students in Greensboro, refused to give up their seats at a dime store lunch counter reserved for whites. These small acts of passive resistance to American apartheid and the cumulative acts of tens of thousands more created a people's movement that eliminated legal segregation in less than a decade. So the NAACP scored a series of Supreme Court cases, victories over a 10-year period, from Smith v. Allwright, eliminating the white primary in 1944, to Brown in 1954, and then helped engineer a decade of legislative successes, from the Civil Rights Act of 1957 to the 1964 Civil Rights and the 1965 Voting Rights Acts. The latter two milestones created what A. Philip Randolph called a crisis of victory. The nonviolent civil disobedience movement that developed in the South in the aftermath of Brown, first in Montgomery in 55 and 56, and then with the 1960 student sit-ins, was both an outgrowth of and a repudiation of the NAACP's dependence on legal tactics. It's a mistake to think that the NAACP's reliance on legal and legislative redress made it uniformly opposed to 1960s-style direct action. While some within the organization were opposed to 1960s-style demonstrations, many others embraced them. As Meyer and Bracey note, NAACP branches were probably the major source of legal aid to the youthful activists of the 1960s and 1961, and the association's own youth councils and college chapters did much to make this phase of the movement effective. Many of the local organizations, created initially to direct post-Brown nonviolent protest, were umbrella groups such as the Montgomery Improvement Association and the Albany, Georgia movement. Others, like the Atlanta Committee on Appeal for Human Rights and the Nashville Student Central Committee, were campus-based student organizations. Many of the organizers of these student groups viewed the NAACP as too slow, too cautious, too rigid, not inclusive of a community's total interest for the quickened pace of militant post-Brown protests. Many of these new groups, however, drew their leadership from adults and students who had received their early initiation into the protest community through the NAACP. For example, each of the officers of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded in 1957 by Martin Luther King, had an NAACP pass. 5 were former or current officers of NAACP branches. 1 had been an NAACP membership chair. 2 were members of local NAACP executive boards. 1 was an NAACP employee. King himself was a board member of the Montgomery NAACP. Rosa Parks, whose heroism catapulted King into national prominence, was youth advisor to the branch and secretary of the Alabama State Conference of Branches. When the NAACP was outlawed in Alabama, the former Birmingham NAACP membership chairman, the Reverend Fred Shulsworth, began a new organization within days. 2 of the 4 college students who jump-started the 1960 sit-in movement were NAACP youth activists. The list of other activists with NAACP connections is long and extensive. As Patricia Sullivan writes in her new history of the NAACP, Ella Baker built on her work with the NAACP during the 1940s, when in April of 1960, she convened the meeting that would lead to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC's Bob Moses told Dr. Sullivan, with reference to NAACP stalwarts in Mississippi, it is inconceivable that we could have taken root without them. Despite its role as incubator of protest and trainer of protest leadership, the NAACP lost its paramount position as the single major leader and strategist of the Black freedom movement because of its inflexibility and frequently patronizing attitude toward the extra-legal movements which followed Brown. In the middle 1950s, its Southern membership had been eroded by debilitating pre- and post-Brown attacks from state officials. Unease over dependence on legal strategies alone further weakened the NAACP's standing in the post-Brown period. Martin Luther King and the dramatic protest efforts of numerous local groups stepped into this vacuum. New organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded in 1957, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded in 1960, came to the fore. Older groups, such as the Congress of Racial Equality, founded in 1942, were given new life and new prominence in the confrontational movement that dominated the agenda of racial advancement in the early and middle 1960s, arguing that legal action alone was insufficient and that a racially and economically unfair system could not police itself through the courts. The late 60s riots, King's murder in 1968, the growth of racial nationalism, the shift of protest from the rural South to the urban North, the activist movement against the war in Vietnam, draining white activists from the Black civil rights movement, the demands of the war itself on the nation's treasury and detention, the first-time elections of Black office holders, the continuing hostility of many white Americans to further gains for Blacks, these and other developments altered the American racial scene. The NAACP's public profile was lowered as the players on the field of racial politics increased. New names, new faces became prominent. No longer could the NAACP stand alone as the civil rights spokesperson for the Black community. Now Black elected officials and other activists competed with the NAACP for the community's allegiance and attention. Having played the major role in increasing opportunity for Blacks in the period immediately following the Second World War, the NAACP was eclipsed by its own success. One ironic mark of this success was the creation of hundreds of new Black single-purpose organizations, most of them founded since the late 60s and early 1970s. Typical are the Association of Blacks in Energy, founded in 1977, the Associated Black Charities, founded in 1982, the Association of Black Admission and Financial Aid Officers of the Ivy League and Sister Schools in 1970, the Association of Black Foundation Executives in 1971, and the Association of Black Psychologists in 1968. These groups and hundreds of others represent Black constituencies that were either non-existent or minuscule before they were expanded or created by the legal, legislative, and activist civil rights victories of the 1960s. They served their members' racial interests single-mindedly, as the NAACP tried to serve all Black American civil rights interests generally in the years before the passage of strong civil rights laws in the 1960s. Yesterday, racism had afflicted all Blacks in the same way. Today, class and occupational status determines both how racism affects some Blacks and how they respond to it. But the NAACP and the civil rights community has suffered as well from a redefinition of civil rights, which has led inexorably to questioning what the civil rights movement is, and expansion of its beneficiaries, and questions about what its goals and tactics should be and who its leadership is. Some definitions here. When I say civil rights, I mean what Webster's defines as U.S. rights secured by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, by certain acts of Congress, abolishing the civil institutes of involuntary servitude. These are the protected rights of a particular class, Black Americans. The civil rights movement, then, was that collection of organizations and personalities engaged in securing rights for Black Americans. For much of the movement, winning those rights was coupled with other strategies: economic development, political participation, educational achievement, all aimed at reducing and removing racism from American life. But in today's public discourse and in the law books, there's no doubt that both Webster's definition of rights and the beneficiaries of those rights have been radically altered and expanded. Rights and race have become decoupled. Today, a majority of the population, through court decisions, legislative acts, administrative order, are among the protected classes, which now include white ethnics, the aged, short people, the chemically dependent, the left-handed, the obese, and all religions. Now, many ethnic, religious, and racial and other groups in America have real and legitimate grievances. Our central moral dilemma, however, is how we treat the one group whose members were enslaved. The nation has a special obligation to Blacks as sole beneficiaries of the 13th Amendment when it comes to defining and remedying discrimination. As the great jurist Frank M. Johnson, Jr. said at a Boston University School of Law commencement in 1979, religious differences, race differences, sex differences, age differences, political differences are not the same. It is no mark of intellectual soundness to treat them as if they are. Moreover, if the life of the law has been experienced, then the law should be realistic enough to treat certain issues as special, as racism is special in American history. In the recent past, Americans came to agree on guaranteeing Blacks' right to vote and to integrate public spaces. They disagree strongly today, however, on both the wisdom of and techniques required for extending equality beyond these public spheres, and many even dispute whether anti-Black bias still persists. This past term, a group representing a utility district in Texas tried to get the United States Supreme Court to gut the jewel of the civil rights law, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The challengers opened their brief to the court by declaring, "The America that has elected Barack Obama as its first African-American president is far different than when the Voting Rights Act was first enacted in 1965. In other words, because Barack Obama won the presidency, we can now dismantle the civil rights protections and organizations that made it possible." Would they have made the same argument after World War II, that because the United States won the war, we could dismiss the soldiers and dismantle the army? The centrality of race in American history makes it impossible to overstate the significance of Obama's election as the 44th president of the United States, or to understate the significance of his race to his critics. His victory does not herald a post-civil rights America, or mean that race as an issue has been vanquished. It will not end structural inequality or eliminate racist attitudes. Arguing otherwise allows for the degradation of the discourse on race and the substitution of culture for physiognomy as the bigot's favorite source of black inferiority, and the return of social Darwinism to the American scene. We are such a young nation, so recently removed from slavery, that only my father's generation stands between Julian Bond and human bondage. I'm the grandson of a slave, as are many in this room. The Civil War that freed my grandfather was fought over whether blacks and whites shared a common humanity. Less than 10 years after it ended, the country chose sides with the losers and agreed to continue black subjugation for almost 100 years. We're now asked to believe that 200 years of being someone else's property, followed by 100 years of oppression in the South and discrimination in the North, can be wiped away by 4 decades of half-hearted remediation and 1 presidential election. We're asked to believe that no permanent damage was done to the oppressors or the oppressed. We're asked to believe that we Americans are now a healed and a whole people. That argument amounts to, at best, a big lie, and at worst, bigotry. Jim Crow may be dead, but racism is alive and well. It is the central fact of life for every non-white American, including the President of the United States. It eclipses income, position, and education. Race trumps them all. That is why much of what the NAACP must do now is as old as the NAACP itself and as new as tomorrow morning. As if spelling out the agenda the NAACP would follow when he helped to found it, Dr. Du Bois told us what must be done as early as 1905 and still must be done today. He said then, we must complain. Yes, plain, blunt complaint, ceaseless agitation, unfailing exposure of dishonesty and wrong. This is the ancient, unerring way to liberty, and we must follow it. Next, he said, we propose to work. These are the things that we must do. We must press the matter for stopping the curtailment of our political rights. We must urge Negroes to vote honestly and effectively. We must push the matter of civil rights. We must organize business cooperation. We must build schoolhouses and increase the interest in education. We must bring Negroes and labor unions into mutual understanding. We must study Negro history, and we must attack crime among us, to do all in our power by word and by deed, to increase the efficiency of our race, the enjoyment of its manhood rights, the performance of its just duties. Today, almost a quarter of black Americans nationwide live below the poverty line as compared to only 8.6% of whites. Black unemployment is at 15% compared to 8.9% for whites. Almost every social indicator, from birth to death, reflects black-white disparities. Infant mortality rates are 146% higher for blacks. Chances of imprisonment are 447% higher. Rates of death from homicide 521% higher. Lack of health insurance 42% more likely. The proportion with a college degree 60% lower. And the average white American will live 5.5 years longer than the average white American. In his New Orleans speech following Hurricane Katrina, President Bush spoke of the deep, persistent poverty which exists in our country. That poverty, he said, has its roots in a history of racial discrimination. The truth is that race trumps class. A scholar has written, concentrated poverty doesn't victimize poor whites in the same way it does poor blacks. NAACP founder Du Bois was one of the first social scientists to link social class to race. He understood then what we must understand now. Race never stands apart from economic realities. The fragility of middle-class life for Black Americans is illustrated by our downward mobility. Nearly half of blacks born into the middle class 40 years ago have descended into poverty or near poverty as adults, compared to only 16% of whites. Home ownership rates for blacks, already low, are sinking under the weight of the subprime mortgage crisis, which stands likely to be the largest loss of African American wealth that we have ever seen, wiping out a generation of human wealth building. Blacks are 3 times more likely to have subprime loans as whites, with such loans accounting for 55% of loans to blacks and only 17% of loans to whites. This didn't happen by accident. There's evidence that minority neighborhoods were actually targeted, that lenders have gone after people whom they think are less sophisticated borrowers. That's why the NAACP has filed 2 major lawsuits, alleging that lenders, including the nation's largest, have engaged in systematic discrimination against minorities. This is a continuation of the work we've been doing for a century. Today, as in the past, the NAACP is the organization African Americans look to when they need wrongs set right. Dr. Du Bois believed that the future of the NAACP, indeed its very survival, depended on securing a firm base among Black Americans and organizing them around a common vision of political and social struggle. Polling data over decades show how successful we've been in achieving Dr. Du Bois' vision. In poll after poll, from the 1960s, when polling and methodology and inclusiveness became reliable, until today, Black Americans overwhelmingly support the NAACP and its work. In April 1963, for example, 90% of blacks viewed the NAACP favorably. Similarly, 92% rated the job done by the NAACP as positive in February 1965. A national poll taken in 2007 found the NAACP had the highest favorability rating of 17 similar organizations working in the civil rights arena, with 94% of blacks rating the NAACP favorably. And last year, no less a source than the Wall Street Journal called the NAACP America's most venerated civil rights organization. When others captured more headlines or more airtime, when new names rose or fell in favor as fashion changed, the NAACP remained constant. Meyer and Bracey say, the association single-mindedly kept to the original goal of securing the basic citizenship rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And as Mary Wright Ovington, another NAACP founder, said at the time, we nailed our flag to the mast. From that time, no one doubted where we stood. She described early on what made the NAACP distinctive. The effort was continually made, she said, to induce the NAACP to sidestep the main issue, to unite with the conservatives, to relax a little our uncompromising tone. Had it done this, it would have slipped into oblivion. Its refusal to compromise brought it steadily increasing Negro support. And while it has never won over the great majority of the white friends of the Negro, it has held its original group together and each year has added a number of important, wholehearted white men and women. From its inception, the NAACP has been what Dr. Sullivan calls an experiment in interracial alliance. Our founders were multiracial and multi-faith. Today, our membership and its leadership is diverse. We have 200 members in our main prison branch. Only 90 inmates there are black. In Seattle and San Jose, our branches have heavy Southeast Asian membership, and in Alabama and Oklahoma, significant Latino membership. A Bangladeshi American recently was elected president of our Hamtramck, Michigan branch. Young people, you always hear this NAACP not attractive to young people. Young people are the fastest growing segment of our membership. In the last year and a half, we've chartered 41 new youth council and college chapters, ranging from the campuses of Harvard and Stanford universities to rural Jasper, Texas, and Piney Woods, Mississippi. We are the only civil rights organization in the country that reserves 7 seats on our board of directors for young people, elected only by young people. Our ACSO programs, that's the Academic, Cultural, Technological, Scientific Olympics, is among the nation's largest program of its kind. More than 26,000 young people have participated in it. Alumni include John Singleton, Kanye West, and Jada Pinkett Smith. We gave $245,000 in scholarship funds to college students last year. We welcome all wholehearted women and men of whatever race, age, color, condition, or religion to join us. In the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, we believe colored people come in all colors. Anyone who shares our values is more than welcome. For Black Americans, some of the news we hear today is good, a testament to our resilience and our persistence, and proof of the opportunity America can offer. If our progress remains incomplete, if too many of us have left the back of the bus for the front of the unemployment line, we ought to take heart. If there's much to be done, we have more to do it with, more than those pioneers who brought us thus far. Never before have we been able to say that a Black man is running the country, a Black woman is running Xerox, and a Black man is the mayor of Philadelphia, Mississippi. None of these momentous changes would have occurred without the work of the modern movement for civil rights and without the work the NAACP has done for the past 100 years. At our founding condition 100 years ago, the NAACP was presented with a petition from Black firemen on Georgia railroads who were being forced out of their jobs by whites. 2 weeks before our centennial convention this year, the United States Supreme Court refused to protect Black firemen in New Haven, Connecticut, from being denied promotions in favor of whites. The court set a new standard for evaluating claims of employment discrimination under Title VII of the '64 Civil Rights Act, ensuring New Haven's senior firefighting ranks would remain predominantly white. This, as Justice Ginsburg noted in dissent, is a profession in which the legacy of racial discrimination cast an especially long shadow, and in a specific department which has increased its minority representation only through litigation-induced efforts. In other words, at our founding condition, Black firemen in Georgia needed the NAACP because the law did not offer them protection. 100 years later, at our centennial convention, Black firemen in Connecticut needed the NAACP because the law did not offer them protection. This sorry saga ought to answer the time-worn question about the NAACP's continued relevance. When the NAACP wages the battle against inequality, we expand democracy for everyone. When we successfully fought to end lynch mobs against African Americans, we also ended mob violence against Italians and Jews and Catholics, who were also targeted for lynching in the South. When we fought for political inclusion, it paved the way for the inclusion of gays, of women, the elderly, practitioners of all religions, members of ethnic groups, and individuals with disabilities. At the local level, the NAACP is the triage center for communities in crisis. We've been in Virginia since 1915, when the Falls Church and Richmond branches were founded. Whether it's helping to organize 5,000 workers at the world's largest pork processing plant in North Carolina last December, or helping organize workers in Alabama in the only factory authorized to make baseball caps for the major leagues, or offering Muslim prisoners in Oregon the right to wear Muslim clothing and have their religion respected, or registering hundreds of mostly white prisoners to vote in Maine, or fighting school closing in low-income neighborhoods in Seattle, or suing the Department of Housing and Urban Development for allowing the governor of Mississippi to divert money designated for Katrina victims. The NAACP is on the ground, we're on the case, and we have been for a century to redress injustices and to right wrongs. Oswald Garrison Villard, grandson of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, an NAACP founder who wrote the call, predicted at the beginning of the NAACP, it all ought to be the beginning of something big. And it was. The beginning of the biggest, baddest, boldest civil rights organization in the history of the world, and still we stand. Thank you.